Wars are not decided only by explosions, heroism, or daring commanders. Some wars are decided quietly inside steel mills, drafting rooms, and shipyards where sparks fly long before the first shot is fired. In the Pacific War, Japan believed it had shattered America's power in a single brilliant morning. But beneath the smoke of Pearl Harbor, another force was already moving, slow, immense, and unstoppable. This is the story of the moment Japan realized it had not crippled a giant. It had only woken one. December 7, 1941. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks still hot from launching the most devastating naval air attack ever carried out, turned northwest and set a course for home. Below deck, in cramped briefing rooms thick with smoke and adrenaline, pilots celebrated wildly. They had crippled 8 American battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,000 Americans. The price had been astonishingly low, just 29 aircraft and fewer than 60 men. But one man did not celebrate. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood apart from the triumph. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, and driven across the vast American continent. He had seen Pittsburgh's steel mills, Detroit's endless factories, and shipyards stretching mile after mile along both coasts. When his officers raised their glasses, Yamamoto spoke softly, almost to himself. "I fear," he said, "that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." His warning was brushed aside. Japan now dominated the Pacific. The American battleship fleet lay shattered in Pearl Harbor's shallow waters. The Philippines would soon fall. The oil-rich Dutch East Indies were nearly secured. And most reassuring of all, America had only 3 operational carriers left in the Pacific: Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga. Japan had 10. On paper, the numbers promised victory. But Yamamoto understood what the numbers hid. America's industrial strength dwarfed Japan's beyond comparison. Before the war, American steel production exceeded Japan's by nearly 12 times. American shipyards could construct vessels Japan could barely imagine. The real question was never whether America could replace its losses, it was whether Japan could win fast enough, before American industry reached full momentum. 6 months later, the math began to turn. June 4, 1942. At Midway, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, burned furiously. American dive bombers struck at the precise moment their hangars were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. By nightfall, all 4 carriers lay beneath the sea. In a single afternoon, Japan's margin of carrier superiority vanished. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff absorbed the blow with forced calm. 4 carriers were lost, but 6 remained: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hyo, Ryujo, and Zuho. America still had only 3, perhaps 4 if Yorktown survived, which she did not. Japanese shipyards were already working on replacements. The war of attrition, they believed, could still be won. What they did not know was this: across America, in Newport News, Quincy, Brooklyn, Norfolk, Philadelphia, and Camden, keels had already been laid for a new kind of weapon. Not 1, not 2, but 24. A new generation of aircraft carriers, larger, faster, and deadlier than anything Japan had ever built. The Essex-Class. The design had been finalized before Pearl Harbor, but after Midway, construction exploded into overdrive. The lead ship, USS Essex, had her keel laid in April 1941. By the time war began, her hull was already rising. After Midway, the shipyards never slept. Welders worked under floodlights. Riveting echoed through the night. The sound of industry became a weapon. In Japan, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal labored on Taiho, the most advanced carrier Japan would ever produce. She boasted an armored flight deck, enclosed bow, and improved damage control, Japan's crowning achievement in naval engineering. Her keel had been laid in July 1941. She would take nearly 3 years to complete. Essex took 20 months. April 30, 1943. USS Essex was commissioned at Newport News, 33,000 tons, capable of carrying 90 aircraft, and racing across the sea at 33 knots. Her flight deck stretched nearly 900 feet. Her crew numbered over 2,600 men. She was larger than every Japanese carrier except Shinano, a converted battleship that would not sail for another year. In Tokyo, naval intelligence noted the event. One new American carrier was troubling but not disastrous. Japanese carriers were still fighting in the Solomons. Shokaku and Zuikaku remained powerful. Taiho would soon join the fleet. The war dragged on. Then the reports began arriving faster. August 17, 1943, USS Yorktown commissioned. November 24, USS Lexington. December 15, USS Bunker Hill. December 31, USS Wasp and USS Cowpens, commissioned the same day. By the end of 1943, 6 Essex-Class carriers were operational, and the intelligence reports showed many more still under construction. Inside the Navy Ministry in Tokyo, unease spread. America was launching fleet carriers faster than Japan could build destroyers. The implications were terrifying. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a naval aviator serving on the 3rd Fleet staff, later wrote that this was the moment Japan's planners realized they were fighting an enemy bound by entirely different rules. Japan built ships with patience and craftsmanship. America built them like automobiles on assembly lines with interchangeable parts, at a speed that defied belief. And the Essex carriers were not just numerous, they were exceptional. Their design reflected hard lessons from the early war. Superior damage control, heavier anti-aircraft firepower, greater fuel capacity, and deck-edge elevators that sped aircraft operations. In many respects, they surpassed even Japan's newest carriers. And America was producing them faster than Japan could sink them. February 17, 1944, USS Hornet. March 20, USS Franklin. April 24, USS Ticonderoga. May 15, USS Randolph. Nearly 1 carrier per month. Japan's entire pre-war carrier fleet, 10 ships built over 20 years, was being matched in less than 12 months. And these new American carriers were larger, stronger, and deadlier. The war had not turned because of one battle. It turned because one nation could replace the sea itself with steel. Admiral Somu Toyota, who would assume command of the combined fleet in May 1944, later laid out Japan's strategic dilemma with rare honesty. From the very beginning, he said, Japan had understood it could never compete with American industrial production. The war plan was built around that weakness. Japan would seize the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia, establish a vast defensive perimeter, and make the cost of breaking through so punishing that the United States would be forced to negotiate. But that strategy depended on one critical factor: time. America had to grow tired before its industrial advantage became unstoppable. The arrival of the Essex-Class carriers shattered that hope. By mid-1944, time was no longer Japan's ally, it had become its enemy. By June, the strategic reality was impossible to ignore. Japan had lost the core of its veteran carrier pilots during the brutal fighting in the Solomons. Those men, trained for nearly 2 years before the war, were gone. Their replacements received barely 6 months of instruction. Fuel shortages meant fewer flight hours, fewer carrier landings, and far less combat readiness. The gap in skill was staggering, and now these undertrained pilots would face not 3 or 4 American carriers, but an entire fleet that outnumbered them beyond any realistic counter. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa led Japan's mobile fleet eastward to challenge the American invasion of Saipan. His force included 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, carrying roughly 450 aircraft. Waiting for him was the U.S. Fifth Fleet. 15 American carriers. 7 of them Essex-Class, Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Essex, Lexington, and Enterprise, supported by 8 light carriers. Together they carried nearly 900 aircraft. But the numbers alone didn't tell the full story. American pilots were experienced, disciplined, and flying superior aircraft. Japanese pilots were largely untested, many on their first combat mission. American carriers operated with radar, centralized fighter direction, and coordinated air defense. Japanese forces relied on visual sightings and individual initiative. At dawn, Ozawa launched his attack in 4 waves. American radar detected the incoming aircraft more than 70 miles out. Guided by radar controllers, F-6F Hellcat fighters intercepted the Japanese formations long before they reached the fleet. What followed would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Lieutenant Commander Robert Winston, flying from USS Lexington, later described the scene. The Japanese planes approached in straight, steady formations, almost as if on a training flight. They did not scatter. They did not evade. Even under attack, they pressed forward as American fighters ripped through them. Winston said it felt almost unreal. And in that moment he realized just how much the war had changed since 1942. By nightfall, Japan had lost approximately 330 aircraft. Then came disaster at sea. Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier, was struck by a single torpedo. Faulty damage control allowed aviation fuel vapors to spread unchecked throughout the ship. Hours later, a spark ignited them. The explosion tore Taiho apart from within. She sank with nearly 1,600 men aboard. Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, absorbed multiple torpedo hits. She followed Taiho to the bottom before the day ended. American losses totaled around 120 aircraft, most lost to mechanical failure or operational accidents. Not a single U.S. ship was damaged. The Battle of the Philippine Sea did more than defeat Japan, it destroyed its carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The loss of hundreds of trained pilots could not be replaced. The loss of 2 fleet carriers could not be replaced. More importantly, the battle proved that Japan was now facing a carrier force it had no conceivable way to defeat. 7 Essex-Class carriers had fought that day. Intelligence reports showed more joining the fleet every month. In the aftermath, Japanese naval leaders confronted the mathematics they could no longer escape. Japan had 6 carriers remaining, 3 of them light carriers with limited aircraft capacity. America had more than 20 carriers already in service, with additional ships commissioning at a relentless pace. The pilot gap was vast and growing. The industrial gap was absolute. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later organize the first kamikaze units, addressed a staff meeting with brutal clarity. "We cannot win a conventional naval war," he said. "We don't have the ships. We don't have the pilots. We don't have the fuel. Every month, America adds carriers faster than we can sink them. The mathematics are impossible." When asked how many carriers America could ultimately build, Onishi gave a simple answer, one backed by intelligence estimates. As many as they want. He was not exaggerating. By the war's end, the United States would commission 17 Essex-Class carriers, with 7 more completed too late to see combat. In addition, America built over 100 escort carriers for convoy protection and amphibious operations. Japan's total carrier output during the entire war amounted to 6 fleet carriers, several light carriers and a handful of conversions. But the disparity went deeper than numbers. Each Essex-Class carrier required roughly 47 million man-hours to construct. America possessed the shipyards, the steel, the trained workforce, the electronics, the radar, the aircraft, the fuel, the ammunition, and the logistics to build and operate dozens of them simultaneously. Japan struggled to complete even one. Admiral Toyota later reflected on this moment with grim clarity. The arrival of the Essex-Class, he said, was the physical realization of Yamamoto's greatest fear. America had fully awakened. Once mobilized, its industrial power was overwhelming. "We believed America would not accept the cost of war," Toyota admitted. But they did, and in industrial terms the cost was insignificant to them. They built carriers, he said, the way Japan built trucks. The comparison was painfully accurate. In 1944 alone, American shipyards launched a major warship approximately every 3 days, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers and submarines. Japan's entire shipbuilding industry could not match the output of American carrier production by itself. The war had been decided not by courage, not by tactics, but by factories that never stopped. October 24–26, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's final major naval operation. The plan was born of desperation. Japan's remaining carriers would sail north as bait, drawing American carrier forces away, while battleships and cruisers struck directly at the invasion fleet inside Leyte Gulf. It was no longer a plan for victory. It was a plan to sacrifice what little remained. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force consisted of just 4 carriers. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from Pearl Harbor, accompanied by 3 light carriers. Together they carried roughly 116 aircraft, barely more than the air group of a single American fleet carrier. Many of the planes were trainers or outdated models. The pilots were poorly trained, some barely qualified for carrier operations at all. Facing them was the American Third Fleet under Admiral William Halsey. 8 fleet carriers. 6 of them Essex-Class, Intrepid, Hancock, Hornet, Franklin, Lexington, and Essex. Together they carried nearly 700 aircraft. Ozawa understood his role perfectly. His mission was not to fight. It was to die. His carriers existed solely to be destroyed, pulling American carrier forces north and away from Leyte Gulf. It was the final admission that Japan's carrier fleet no longer had any operational purpose. The carriers were expendable. The pilots were expendable. Only time mattered, and even that was slipping away. On October 25, American aircraft located Ozawa's force. Strike after strike followed. Waves of American aircraft descended without pause. Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz and the Philippine Sea, was hammered by bombs and torpedoes. By afternoon she capsized and sank beneath the waves. The 3 light carriers followed her to the bottom. With them, Japan's carrier force ceased to exist. The last survivor of Pearl Harbor was gone. The once feared mobile fleet was finished. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff understood immediately that the war was lost. The loss of the carriers themselves mattered little. Japan had no pilots, no aircraft, no fuel left to operate them even if they had survived. What mattered was what those losses symbolized. America had built a carrier fleet Japan could not challenge, could not match, could not even meaningfully damage. And still the Essex-Class carriers kept arriving. USS Bon Richard commissioned in November 1944. USS Leyte in April 1945. USS Philippine Sea in May. They entered service to find no Japanese carriers left to fight. Commander Masatake Okumiya later wrote about the psychological impact of this production pace. Japanese officers, he said, had studied American industrial capacity before the war. They had seen the numbers. But numbers were abstract. The Essex-Class carriers made those numbers real. Every month, another appeared. Then another. Then another. It felt, Okumiya wrote, like fighting an enemy who could replace every loss instantly, while you slowly bled to death from wounds you had no way to heal. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 were, in part, a response to this reality. Conventional attacks could not sink carriers faster than America built them. Turning the aircraft and the pilot into the weapon itself offered the only remaining mathematical possibility of inflicting losses America might not be able to absorb. It was an admission that Japan had already lost the industrial war. Even this failed. The Essex-Class carriers proved extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Improved compartmentalization, reinforced structures, and advanced damage control systems allowed them to survive punishment that would have sunk earlier ships. USS Franklin absorbed 2 devastating bomb hits that killed more than 700 men and ignited massive fires. She survived. USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikazes, killing nearly 400. She survived. USS Intrepid was hit by kamikazes 5 separate times. She survived. Of the 17 Essex-Class carriers that saw combat, not one was sunk. Several were badly damaged. All returned to service. After the war, American occupation authorities conducted extensive interrogations of Japanese naval officers under the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Again and again the same conclusion emerged. Competing with American industrial production had been impossible. Admiral Toyota was asked directly when he realized Japan could no longer win. His answer was precise. "We always knew America's industrial capacity was greater than ours," he said. But when intelligence reports showed fleet carriers appearing month after month, the reality became undeniable. We could not build them that fast. We could not train pilots that fast. We could not produce aircraft that fast. We could not do anything at the speed America could. Asked why Japan continued fighting after this became clear, Toyota paused. "Because surrender was unthinkable," he finally said. "And because we hoped, irrationally, that America's will might break before our capacity collapsed. It was never a sound calculation. But it was all we had." The Essex-Class carriers represented more than naval power. They embodied the industrial gulf that made the outcome of the Pacific War inevitable once America fully mobilized. Japan had entered the war knowing it could not match American production. The gamble was that it would not need to. That gamble failed. The Essex-Class carriers arrived too quickly in too great a number with too much capability. They made a war of attrition unwinnable. They transformed the Pacific from a contested ocean into an American lake. By war's end, 17 Essex-Class carriers had entered combat service, with 7 more completed after hostilities ceased. Many would serve for decades, fighting again in Korea and Vietnam. In many respects, they became the most successful carrier class ever built, not only because of what they could do, but because of what their production represented. In the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo, in the months after Leyte Gulf, staff officers sometimes stood at the windows overlooking the city. They knew American bombers would come. They knew the war was lost. And they knew, quietly, that it had been lost in industrial terms before the first shot was fired. One officer, whose name history never recorded, reportedly said to a colleague, "Yamamoto tried to warn us. He told us we would awaken a giant. We didn't believe the giant was truly that large." "And when did you understand?" the colleague asked. "When the carriers kept appearing," the officer replied. "One after another. Then we knew." "Knew what?" "That we had started a war," he said, "with a nation that could build warships faster than we could count them." The Essex-Class carriers were not just ships. They were the visible tide of American industry, unstoppable, unmatchable, and ultimately decisive, rolling across the Pacific until the ocean itself no longer belonged to anyone else.